In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Red Scare of the 1950s. We're also going to take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis at the end of the lesson. As the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States intensified in the late 1940s and early 1950s, hysteria over the perceived threat posed by communists in the United States became known as the Red Scare. Communists were often referred to as Reds for their allegiance to the Red Soviet flag. The Red Scare led to a range of actions that had a profound and enduring effect on U.S. government and society. The intense rivalry between the two superpowers raised concerns in the United States that communists and leftist sympathizers inside America might actively work as Soviet spies and pose a threat to U.S. security. These ideas were not totally unfounded. The USSR had long carried out espionage activities inside America with the aid of U.S. citizens, particularly during World War II. This cartoon shows the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, fingerprinting a federal employee. And this was because on March 21, 1947, President Truman issued Executive Order 9835, known as the Loyalty Order, which mandated that all federal employees be analyzed to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the government. This was because members of Congress, particularly Republican members of Congress, were accusing the Truman administration of having communist sympathizers inside the government. Truman's loyalty program, though, was a startling development for a country that prized the concepts of personal liberty and freedom of political organization. Yet this was only one of the many questionable activities that occurred during the period of anti-communist hysteria known as the Red Scare. The House Un-American Activities Committee was formed in 1938. HUAC's investigations frequently focused on exposing communists working inside the federal government or subversive elements working in the Hollywood film industry, and the committee gained new momentum following World War II as the Cold War began. Under pressure from the negative publicity aimed at their studios, movie executives created blacklists that barred suspected radicals from employment. Similar lists were also established in other industries. Here we see photos of actors coming to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. We have a young Ronald Reagan here as head of the Screen Actors Guild testifying before the House Committee. On the Senate side, U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin became the person most closely associated with the anti-communist crusade and with its excesses. McCarthy used hearsay and intimidation to establish himself as a powerful and feared figure in American politics. He leveled charges of disloyalty at celebrities, intellectuals, and anyone who disagreed with his political views. This cost many of his victims their reputations and jobs. McCarthy's reign of terror continued until his colleagues formally denounced his tactics in 1954. McCarthy's focus was largely on communist sympathizers in government agencies, and he wanted those, if there were any, he wanted them out, either out of government completely or certainly out of areas where they had access to sensitive information. With the rise of television, though, people are going to see McCarthy in the hearings that Senator McCarthy held to investigate communists in the U.S. Army. On full display were his bullying tactics, and most Americans were turned off by what they saw at that point. There were two spy cases that fanned the flames of the Red Scare. Much of the information had been gathered by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. The first one is of Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss, in the photo on the top left, was a high-ranking State Department official during and after World War II. He was accused of giving State Department secrets to the gentleman in both the photos on the right, Whittaker Chamber, who passed that information along to the Russians. He lied under oath and was convicted of perjury, so he was jailed for 4 years, lying about whether or not he gave Whittaker Chambers that information. The other spy case in 1951 was that of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were found guilty of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. The Rosenbergs were executed in 1953 uh, for treason after having been convicted of treason in 1951. It would take until the later 1950s for the Red Scare, for America's fears to calm down, but understand that many people's rights were violated because of America's partly unjustified fears of communist infiltration and communist activity inside the United States. Now, clearly there was some, but a lot of people's lives were ruined. Careers were ruined with allegations that were unproven of their activities. And plus, people that wanted to just join the Communist Political Party of the United States essentially were not able to. So there was a lot of leftist activity that really declined during this period out of fear of being labeled communist or subversive. We're going to move forward to 1962 now, away from the Red Scare, and to an event called the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the time during the Cold War where the United States and the Soviet Union came closest to actual nuclear war. In 1959, Fidel Castro took power in Cuba with assistance from the United States, and upon taking power, promptly aligned himself with the Soviet Union. The Soviets were thrilled, of course, and what we see here is spy plane footage of the Soviets setting up nuclear missile sites in Cuba. These photos, the United States brought these photos to the attention of the United Nations, and this was going to be President John F. Kennedy's problem to handle in 1962. This map here shows the island of Cuba in the center and the missile locations in red, and the fact that these medium-range missiles would be able to take out any points in the southeastern United States and just about Washington, D.C., which is slightly at the end of the range of these missiles. So here we see Kennedy conferring with the joint, I believe it's the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Anyway, on October 22nd, you can see he takes to the airwaves on TV and tells America that he's going to send the Navy down to Cuba to quarantine, this is his words, Cuba, to prevent the Soviets from bringing more missiles into Cuba. Soviet ships were on the way to. What happened between the 22nd and the late October there was essentially a game of brinksmanship. You now had U.S. ships face to face with Soviet ships, and the question was who was going to blink first. All right, and this tense standoff, America was watching. Everybody knows where they were during the Cuban Missile Crisis because everybody was worried about the very real threat of nuclear war. Ultimately, though, Premier Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, decides to order his ships to be turned around. You can see here in the photo Kennedy and Khrushchev meet, and the deal that is struck later is that the Soviets agree to scrap the bases to take the missiles in Cuba out of Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. And that brings an end to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the period of the Cold War where the U.S. and the Soviets came closest to nuclear. So then, just to sum up quickly, the Red Scare of the late 1940s and early to mid-1950s was a fear of communist conspiracy to overthrow the government. This led to loyalty checks of federal employees that President Truman instituted in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee probe of communists in government and Hollywood, and Senator McCarthy's probe from his Senate Committee of Communists in Government. The spy cases fueled this fear, the Alger Hiss case and the Rosenberg's case, because these were instances where you really did have individuals with access to sensitive information, passing that information along. So both the House Committee and Senator McCarthy used these cases to continue to fan the flames of fear. And then lastly, separate from the Red Scare itself, moving forward to 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the U.S.-Soviet standoff over the placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba by the Soviets, and this was the point where the U.S. and Soviet Union came closest to actual nuclear war.